Hello, everybody, and welcome to our lecture on the home front of World War II. And today we're going to be talking about a number of issues related to the home front during World War II. First and foremost, being the ways in which the United States mobilized for war, used its immense industrial and other capacities to be able to, to produce for the war. Mobilizing its population, and so on. And as part of that, we're going to talk about the role of women during World War II. We're also going to talk about some of the sort of negatives of mobilization and preparing for war, and that includes the internment of many Japanese Americans in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And we'll also talk about the role of other racial groups in the United States during World War II, most notably both African Americans and Latinos. During the late 1930s, much like during World War I, the U.S. boosted its production of all sorts of things in order to aid its allies in Europe: food, weapons, and so on. The U.S. also boosted domestic military spending, as FDR feared the escalating crisis in Europe. But despite this, when the U.S. entered the war in December of 1941, it was ill-prepared. The U.S. military had only 1.6 million men in it, and war production was only 15% of total industrial output. By the end of the war, 15 million men and 350,000 women had served in the U.S. military. Many millions more had aided in producing things for the war effort. The economy itself would be radically refashioned to deal with the needs of the war. In 1940, Hitler had laughed at the idea that the U.S. could produce 50,000 planes a year, saying America was nothing but beauty queens, millionaires, and Hollywood. By late 1942, 1/3 of the economy was producing for the war, and it was producing war materials equal to Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. During the course of the war, the U.S. produced 300,000 military aircraft, 3 million machine guns, 89,000 tanks, 7 million rifles, 5,000 cargo ships, 6 million tons of bombs, and countless other things. Thus, much like the New Deal, the trend was for an ever larger federal government. And yet the growth in government during the New Deal paled in comparison to that during World War II. And this increased spending pulled the United States out of the Depression. Defense spending made up 9% of GNP in 1940, and by 1945, it accounted for 46% of spending. Overall, the budget grew from $9 to $98 billion a year. And it wasn't just growth in the military, however. Civilian jobs grew from 1.1 to 3.8 million. Unemployment, which was still at 14% in 1940, dropped to 2% in 1943. Much of this growth was created by increased government regulation and control of the economy. The War Productions Board, which was created in 1942, served a similar function to the War Industries Board during World War I. It sought to convert industries to wartime needs. This is what enabled such a dramatic reshaping of the American economy. In 1941, 3 million automobiles were built in the United States. During the next 4 years, however, only 139 automobiles were built. Instead, Ford and GM, all the car companies, they produced tanks, jeeps, trucks, and warplanes. All of this increased production cost money. And as a whole, the United States spent more than $320 billion to win the war. That's $250 million per day. And that's more than $3 trillion in today's money. This was 10 times the amount that was spent by the United States in World War I in real dollars. Almost twice the amount of money spent by the federal government since its founding up to that point. To pay for the overall cost, again, more than $3 trillion in today's money, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1942. Most workers began paying taxes. In 1939, only about 5% of workers had been eligible to pay taxes. By 1945, about 90% were. This paid for about 45% of the cost. The rest was the result of borrowing, including $185 billion worth of government war bonds. The national debt increased 600% during the war. Another institution that was created was the Office of Price Administration. This was first established by executive order in August of 1941. It became a fully independent and functioning agency by the Emergency Price Control Act that was passed in January of 1942. The OPA had the power to place ceilings on all prices except agricultural commodities, and to ration scarce supplies of other items, including tires, automobiles, shoes, nylon, sugar, gasoline, fuel oil, coffee, meats, and processed foods. At the peak, almost 90% of retail food prices were frozen, meaning they couldn't be raised. The OPA effectively gave consumers a voice, or at least some form of representation. But it was not a permanent gain. At the war's end, many consumers actually wanted the OPA to continue. But it was eliminated in March 1947 despite numerous public protests, primarily by women. In addition to rationing supplies, and particularly food items, the government also tried to encourage home production, including the use of victory gardens. And you see that obviously there's a superheroes right here, comic book advertising a victory garden. You see signs and posters advertising victory gardens. And as a whole, this was actually quite successful. Millions of Americans started growing their own food. Millions of Americans started canning their own food or increased their canning supply. Elementary schools started having victory gardens, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, would help reduce the needs of the American public for food that then could be shipped to Europe to take care of American soldiers, and in some cases, European populations. And through its spending, the federal government was able to reshape the geography of American production. Much of the money, of course, went to traditional industrial cities, most notably Detroit, where the American auto industry was quickly converted towards producing planes and tanks and jeeps and so on for the war effort. But most notable during World War II was the growth of California and the West. Overall, about 10% of all federal war contracts went to California. 250,000 people worked the shipyards around San Francisco. 250,000 more worked in the Southern California aircraft industry. Washington State saw shipyards and an aircraft industry develop. Denver, Colorado was home to a massive Remington plant manufacturing guns. But the South also saw new industrial development. Mobile, Alabama grew from a village to a city with the help of a new aluminum plant, 2 large shipyards, an air base, and an RV supply depot. In the years after the war, the South would see a huge economic boom as military bases and industrial contracts were regularly awarded in the South. And this industrial growth, as well as the shortage of labor, led to another wave of internal migration. As a whole, 6 million rural Americans moved to cities, including 2 million African Americans. This created housing shortages in industrial areas, leading the federal government to get into the business of providing housing for war workers, which would carry over into the post-war world as millions of returning GIs needed places to live, and the housing industry, at least initially, couldn't keep up. Remember, the housing industry, the construction industry, really suffered during the Great Depression. And many have called this the Second Great Migration. World War II also had an impact on labor and on unions. More and more workers joined unions. For Black Americans, overall union membership doubled during the war to a total of 1.25 million members. But overall, membership continued to increase in size, from 9 to almost 15 million during the war. By the end of the war, unions represented about 35% of all non-farm workers. Now, with few exceptions, labor did not strike during the war. Unions effectively agreed not to strike and to accept wage increases no more than 15% in a trade for significant federal backing of unionization. This slide, I think, is just kind of funny, though. You're talking about Air Force pilots, the need to be aware and awake, and there's a push to have your pilots take amphetamines to be able to do that, to sort of, to make a bad joke, to sort of speed through the job of flying planes for long hours in dangerous conditions. Women also played a very significant role in the war effort. 8 million women entered the workforce. And during the war, overall, 19 million women were working. Characters like Rosie the Riveter, the most recent, or one of the alleged Rosie the Riveters actually recently passed away. But characters like Rosie the Riveter were used as promotional materials to convince women to enter trades not typically open to women. Riveter, of course, being the person that sort of puts the rivets in when they're building airplanes. Between 1940 and 1945, women grew from less than 25% of the workforce to more than 33% of the total workforce. More important, many of these women were married, older, and some even had children. Prior to this, most women who were able didn't work after getting married, and especially after having children. They also worked in jobs not traditionally held by women, in factories and other industrial jobs. But they're still paid less, about 65 cents on the dollar compared to male employees doing the same work. The expectation was that women were entering the workforce only temporarily, that after the war, women would return home and that their husbands would return to those jobs. And to a large extent, this would be true. But it instilled in many women a desire to have the freedom of having a job. And women's efforts and capabilities were recognized, at least for a short while. Both with the case of women, but also with African Americans, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. Their efforts during the war really helped create a push, momentum for demanding more rights in American society. And of course, here you see women railroad workers. And in this slide, you see a couple things going on. This is advertising FDR's well-known, the four freedoms: freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, right? But also advertising, obviously, the need to buy war bonds. What you see during World War II, much like during World War I, are efforts made by the government, in this case the Office of War Information, to create propaganda to push for the war. And of course, you're coming out of the Great Depression, right? You've had this period where you've had people really suffering, and a lot of the depictions that you see are, this is what we'll have after the war is over, right? And you see that top left image of what looks like it could well be like a Thanksgiving dinner, or at least a really nice weekend dinner. And this was done in coordination with the War Advertising Council and with private industries, with Hollywood, really took a leading role. Another example you see of that is what are called the Why We Fight films, these shorts that would be shown in movie theaters that the public would be invited to go to, that were organized and produced by Hollywood studios, that were effectively just propaganda, right? That were explaining to people why they were going to fight, why there was a need for American involvement, what Americans needed to do to sacrifice for the war effort, and so on and so forth. I mentioned, obviously, Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. These are depicted by Norman Rockwell that some of you may be familiar with. And then, of course, there's a so-called fifth freedom, the idea of consumer freedom. And this is something that obviously is being depicted in things like the OPA, the Office of Price Administration, this need to provide consumers with accessible and affordable food and other things. One of the really significant blemishes having to do with World War II and the American home front is the internment of Japanese Americans following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Following Pearl Harbor, California's white population became vehemently anti-Japanese. With California's high population of Japanese immigrants, coupled with false reports that Hawaii's Japanese population had aided in the attacks, many in California called for the removal of Japanese from coastal areas. In February of 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal of anyone seen as a threat from military areas. This resulted in the internment of 37,000 Issei's, or first-generation Japanese immigrants, and 75,000 Nisei's, native-born Japanese Americans, from the West Coast. They were forced to sell their property. Japanese Americans lost at least $2 billion in property and possessions. They were moved to camps in isolated parts of the West and the Great Plains, surrounded by barbed wire and forced to live in group barracks. All of this despite the fact that not a single case was tried for disloyalty by any Japanese Americans, and no substantial evidence was found of suspicious activity. In 1944, in the Korematsu case, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the executive order. Finally, by 1944, the government allowed some out of the camps to take jobs or attend college or even to join the military, but they were not allowed on the West Coast. Over 17,000 of them actually ended up serving in the military. Many of them actually volunteered for service. But you'll notice here that there's a huge distinction in which Japanese Americans are being interned. Those that are along the West Coast were interned, but those in Hawaii were not. And there's an explanation for that, because on the one hand, you might obviously assume, well, why wouldn't they intern them in Hawaii, where the Pearl Harbor attacks actually took place? And that's because they were such a substantial portion of the population of Hawaii that it would not have been able to continue functioning without them. Whereas on the West Coast, while they did exist in large numbers, they were able to be removed without significantly affecting the ability of these Western states to operate. And so it's much easier, much more convenient for such a thing to happen. And ultimately, it helped make people feel safe, even if there was no actual threat to American interests. But obviously, that's not me trying to defend it, but simply offering an explanation of why it happened the way it did. Here's an image of, in the internment camps, in these group houses. But also during World War II, you start to see efforts by African Americans to mobilize and to push for civil rights. For African Americans, World War II meant an opportunity to advance their desire for civil rights. They campaigned for double V, double victory, victory in the war and victory over racial oppression. During the war, membership in the NAACP grew nearly 10 times. In 1945, the NAACP had 500,000 members. In 1942, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, was founded, and it started fighting for desegregation in the North. Now, while gains overall that were won by African Americans were pretty limited during the war, there were some successes. In June of 1941, FDR issued Executive Order 8802, prohibiting discrimination in employment in federal government and unions and businesses related to the war effort. For enforcement, it established the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Although there was poor enforcement, high demand for labor still sparked significant gains in African American employment. 2 million Black Americans gained jobs in industries, 200,000 in the federal civil service. Black Americans secured significant wage increases from $457 to $1,976 per capita income, compared with beginning at $1,064 to $2,600 for white Americans. 1 million Black Americans served in the military, and previously they had served only in menial positions, but now they're beginning to serve at all levels. In 1940, only 5 Black officers were in the U.S. military. In 1945, there were over 7,000. Yet, most Black Americans served in segregated units. And despite this, most of them served admirably. While at the outset, Black units were reserved for menial tasks, in late 1944, Eisenhower agreed to let all Black units fight in combat roles, though they were generally almost exclusively commanded by white officers. Elsewhere, 600 African American pilots trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, later known as the Tuskegee Airmen, that you may be familiar with. They ultimately flew more than 15,000 missions, often serving as the defenses for American bombers. They served admirably enough to persuade many officers and others to push for desegregation at the end of the war. However, segregation was reimposed in the military at the end of the war. Similar to women, participation in the war and the economic independence gained during the war gave African Americans new confidence and expectations for future gains. Yet, there were also numerous violent racial incidents. In 1943, there were 274 race-related incidents in 50 big cities. The big example was in Detroit, where a full-fledged riot broke out. For 2 days, fighting continued until federal troops finally arrived. 29 Black Americans and 9 white Americans were killed. More than 700 injured. And in the midst of the Great Depression, Mexican farm laborers had been pushed back into Mexico. But once the war began, with the labor shortages that resulted, America began pushing for renewed Mexican migrant labor. The Mexican government refused to participate unless the U.S. government guaranteed decent housing and working conditions. The result was the Emergency Farm Labor Program that was created in 1942, and it was dubbed the Bracero Program. Under the program, Mexico would provide about 70,000 seasonal farm workers on year-long contracts between 1942 and 1945. They were supposed to return to Mexico at the end of the war. The success of the program, however, and the continued labor shortage even after the end of the war, led the program to be extended well into the 1960s. 300,000 Mexican American citizens also served in the armed forces. Despite this, there was constant racial hostility between white and Latino Americans, especially in the Western United States. In 1943, for example, several thousand off-duty sailors and soldiers joined hundreds of other whites in a rampage through Los Angeles, assaulting people of color, Latinos, African Americans, and others. The riots lasted a week and were named the Zoot Suit riots after the attire commonly worn by flamboyant Latino youth. And you see an image of these zoot suits in the bottom of the screen here. And these are essentially just like very baggy suits. And many white Americans were sort of offended, I guess you could say, by them, not simply because they went against the sort of fashion norms of white society, but they also saw them as incredibly wasteful of cloth and fabric, things that were in high demand, high need because of the war effort. And so many white Americans in Los Angeles and elsewhere saw these as unpatriotic. Because it was wasting this valuable fabric. Okay, so that is all we're going to cover. Or that's all we're going to cover for the home front. But next time we'll be getting into the origins of the Cold War, including the end of the war in both Europe and in Japan, and most obviously the use of the atomic bomb. And I'll see you then.